Okay, so right now we're going to go ahead and start on your final big review for the Unit 2 AP Macro exam. There's several different concepts I'm going to jump around to and give you guys some examples, and hopefully you'll be able to work them out pretty well. So first thing I wanted to go over is your simple graph of the money market. Now, the money market looks like this. We have right here the supply of money, and we know that the supply of money is controlled by who? The Federal Reserve. That there is a fixed quantity of money that we would probably want to label down here, quantity of money. And over here we have the interest rate. So this is our interest rate equilibrium. The thing to keep in mind is what kind of policies the Federal Reserve or other actions may cause upon the money market. And if it changes the quantity of money, you want to see what kind of effect we're going to have on the interest rate. So, if the Federal Reserve goes ahead and changes the supply of money, let's say they go ahead and buy bonds. What would that do to the supply of money?
Increase.
Right. That means the Fed buys bonds. That means who gets the bonds? The Fed. Where does the money go? Into the economy. Therefore, the money supply would increase. What kind of effect would this have on the interest rate? The answer is the new interest rate is going to decrease. Now, keep in mind, a decreased interest rate would do what to investment spending?
Decrease it?
It would increase it. A lower interest rate is going to go ahead and cause people to demand more in loans. So if investment spending increases, that would cause a shift. I think I've got to go this way. It would cause a shift in investment here, and a shift in investment would go ahead and cause aggregate demand to shift. Remember, the monetary policy shifts aggregate what? Demand. Okay? So remember, a shift in the supply of money causes interest rates to decrease. If interest rates decrease, it's going to intersect, well, that's not going to shift, but it's going to intersect right here on investment, causing our new rate of investment to be right here. Because investment spending is increased, CIG, I is investment spending increase, that would mean they would demand more investment goods, causing two things to happen. Well, three things. Okay, one, output would increase when we have our new line of output here. Because output increases, that causes unemployment to decrease because we're producing more goods. And it will also cause what else to happen? Inflation. So here was our initial line, and here's going to be our price level equilibrium, and here's our PL1. So we'd also have inflation.
Why do you get inflation for?
Why do we get inflation?
Because unemployment lowers, so that Phillips curve, right? Is that what it is?
Yes. So remember, a shift in demand. We're going to have increased inflation, and therefore what happens to unemployment? A decrease in unemployment. If it was a supply shift, but by the way, can monetary policy cause a supply shift? No, only in the way that increased investment spending may increase long-run aggregate supply because of increased capital goods, but that's more on the production curve. Hopefully you understood what I just said. But what this means is Phillips curve, we'd move along the Phillips curve. An increase in inflation will cause a decrease in unemployment. All right? That's our quick little snap for some monetary policy, the money supply. However, when we talk about the money supply, we also want to keep into account the idea that the ideas of the effects on the money supply and what causes people to hold money. We know that people will hold more money. I believe we covered this earlier. Hold more money in various different times. For example, they'll hold more money if the interest rate is lower. A lower interest rate means that they're not going to put a lot of money, they're not going to save a lot of money into investment. They'd rather hold it because it means more to them. Also, high inflation. There's high inflation or expected inflation. If you expect there to be higher inflation, you're going to hold more money because you're speculating what's going to happen. Prices are going to go increase, and you're going to need that money to buy the things you normally need. So keep in check the ideas of why you would need to hold on to more money.
So wait, Lower interest rate, you hold more money.
Right, because that means if you're going to save it, because the interest rate's lower, what rate of return do you get back?
Oh, you mean hold it like as in like you have it on?
Yes, you have it on you, so you can cash it out. Okay, now let's move on to banks. So as we move on to banks, we need to kind of get to, that's actually a pretty good place to be. So we get to banks, we need to make sure we are well versed with our T account. Our T account, remember, we go ahead and we draw our T, and we divide it up into what? Assets. Oops. So we have our assets and our liabilities. All right. So what's going to go into our liabilities?
Demand deposits.
All right, what goes into it is going to be our demand deposits, okay? Our checkable deposits, our checking accounts. So here we're going to have deposits. And if we have liabilities, that means a bank's going to want to turn them into assets. So first off, a bank is going to go ahead and take deposits. So let's go ahead and imagine that a bank goes ahead and has $1,000 as a deposit. That means we come over here and let's go ahead and say that they've given out $900 in loans. And that's an asset because if they give out a loan, they're going to get what? That money back. Whereas the deposit is going to require the bank to do what? Give that money back to whoever the consumer is. So I have $900 in loans. They're going to have $50 in excess reserves. How much would their reserve requirement, or required reserves?
5%.
How much would it be?
$50.
Okay, so you go, it would have to be another $50, which means what's the reserve requirement? Okay, the reserve requirement is going to be 5%, and that is an important number to know. Now, our reserve requirement, if we changed it, let's go ahead and see. If we changed it to $100, what would this bank have to do? I'm sorry, if we changed it to 10%, so let's cross this out and say, hey, let's say we have 10%. What is the bank going to have to do?
Increase their required reserves to $100.
It's going to have to increase its required reserves to 100. So basically, we'd eliminate this, and our required reserves would now turn into $100. Okay? Does that make sense? What's the money multiplier at 10% reserves?
100.
The money multiplier is going to be 10. Okay? Remember, at 10%, we go ahead and say the money multiplier is the amount of excess reserves or loans a bank could give out. And then we're going to have the 0.1, which is the reserve requirement. So we go 0.1. How many times does 0.1 go into 1? 10. Therefore, we know how much money will enter the economy if they deposit $1,000.
Wait, can you ask that again?
With this deposit of $1,000 in a bank, how much extra money will enter the economy? With a multiplier of what? 10.
$9,000?
The answer is?
9,000? 90,000?
It's a multiplier of 10? $10,000. Okay?
Times it by the deposit?
You got it.
Okay.
By deposit. What if it was 5%? If the required reserve is 5%, what would the multiplier be? It would be 20. And therefore, how much money would enter the economy? $20,000. What other effects would this have then by reducing the reserve requirement?
Wait, why would it be 10,000? Like, I thought you timed this by the loans.
You multiply by the amount entered.
So times by.
Yeah. So what happens if, here, let's go back and make this 5% again. What's the multiplier? Therefore, how much money would enter the economy? 20,000. That would cause what to occur? An increase in the money supply, which would cause inflation. There would be lower interest rates. You'd have then an increase in investment, an increase in aggregate demand, inflation, lower unemployment, increased production. So that who dictates the reserve requirement? That's the Fed. And where's a place that a bank can? Where does the bank have to store their reserves? In the Fed, as well as who can they get a loan from if they don't have enough to make it into? Okay. They go to the other bank. So they go to the discount window, and the Fed has a discount rate. However, the discount rate is used to dictate what again? Not the reserve requirement, but the federal funds rate. Because remember, a bank could go to the Fed, and the Fed would say, I'll give you a loan, but it's at 5%. Where else could that bank get a loan to make sure they had the required reserves?
Discount window? I mean the
Other bank.
Other banks. But the other banks would have to offer what?
a lower interest rate.
A lower interest rate. So they'd offer 4.9%. However, and that's the federal funds rate. It's the rate that banks give loans, short-term loans, to other banks. So if the Fed changes their interest rate to 3%, what would other banks have to offer? A lower interest rate of 2.9%, which means if banks are getting money for 2.9% instead of 5%, they could offer you a loan at a lower interest rate. So the Fed can control, just with the reserve requirement, as well as with the discount window, as well as open market operations, the money supply, therefore the interest rates, therefore the amount of investment spending, therefore the aggregate demand. But remember, that brings with it inflation. And as the inflation comes, people expect inflation. So if people start expecting inflation, it causes a big problem, something called the theory of rational expectations, which means what will happen to output if people simply expect prices to go up?
They'll buy more now.
Okay, what they would do is all of a sudden you'd say, hey, we're going to have an increase in demand, right? With this extra money and lower interest rates. However, if you're expecting that, what kind of wages would you demand right now if you expect or in the future if you're expecting prices to go up? What would increase wages? What effect would this have on our ADAS model?
Inflation.
Well, inflation, but how do we get to inflation? Right now we have extra output. Less supply. Higher wages and higher prices for inputs would cause supply to go up, and you would just simply get what? Not the same. Same output, but inflation. So that's the theory of rational expectations. The idea that if people expect the Fed to always step in and add money, the market will respond, and therefore all you get is what? Inflation. So the Fed has to convince people that they're not going to add money to the economy. And when you all believe it won't happen, then they have to do it. But if you expect the Fed to always do it, all you get is inflation. Okay? So I'll move those back. So our T accounts, make sure we're focusing on how banks work and how they relate to one another. All right. We also want a nice little theory here about monetarists. By the way, understanding how this relates to how much the banks have in loans or how much a bank has in excess reserves, finding out what your multiplier is. These are important questions, and you'll see several of them on the T accounts like this. Know what information you need, know what information is irrelevant, solve the problem.
How did you find the multiplier?
So we found the multiplier because I'm assuming that Tommy went ahead and said, hey, look, 900 here, 1,000 here. What's that a ratio of?
9 to 1 to 9. I would say.
Yeah, you see, okay, I see 9, I see 10, therefore it must be 9 tenths. But we know it's not 90%, we know it's 10%. Okay? Is that pretty easy?
Yeah.
Yeah, so. All right, basically subtract. And then divide if you need to find something more complicated. But do the math, understand the concept, and you should get it. Is this hard math? No. I had all my A-push kids telling me about how much hard math is in econ, and AP econ, and everyone has to do it, and no calculators, and it's so hard. And I was going, no, there's only just a few people who can't divide. Okay. I'm sorry, what was that?
I said, hey.
What's your name again?
McKenna.
Okay. Emily obviously has a cold today. All right. So some other idea that you guys need to make sure you understand is the theory of monetarism. There's like that Friedman idea, which means we need a formula. And what's that formula? Quantity of money, supply of money. What's V?
Velocity of money.
Very good. Equals
P times Y.
Y or Q. And they're basically the same thing.
What is this?
This is monetarist idea. What this means is they said that the amount of money times the velocity of money equals the price level times the amount of output, which is GDP. So here's our price level. Here's our real GDP, or our GDP, or real GDP. This is the velocity of money, and here's the amount of money. The idea was velocity should always stay the same. So if you lightly increase the supply of money, what has to increase over here if you can keep prices stable? If you keep prices stable, you simply get more output. Hey, it solves problems. We can always increase the economy. They're proving that it doesn't work quite like that. But keep in mind, if you keep the money supply stable, but all of a sudden your prices and quantity here are increasing, that must mean what's not constant? The velocity. Make sure you just understand what each of these mean and how one would affect the other. That, look, if stays the same, changes, what has to change? Velocity. It needs to balance. This isn't like hard chemistry equations you need to balance. It's just this kind of stuff. All right, so that's a monetarist ideal. Now, one thing that you should also know about this is what monetarists think of fiscal policy. So, what monetarists think of fiscal policy is they think that it does what?
The economy.
No, they would say, don't use fiscal policy, use monetary policy. Hence why they're called monetarists. They say fiscal policy will only have what big effect? Let's see if I can find a better graph. No. Well, here, I can use this one. Okay, monetarists would say, well, first we're going to kind of ignore this guy right here, because that would be monetary policy. What they would say is this: the government spends money. So the government spends money, and they need to do what to get this money for fiscal policy to take effect? They spend money and also raise taxes a lot. They don't get much of an effect. So they do what kind of spending?
Investment spending?
No, deficit spending. So the federal government does deficit spending. So they get a lot of money and they spend it. And that moves what? On this graph over here. What moves over here?
Ag demand.
Aggregate demand. Because monetary policy, like fiscal policy, only moves what?
Aggregate demand.
Aggregate demand. So we get an increase in aggregate demand, which means fiscal policy solves all of our problems except for the deficits. However, they would say, no, actually all you get is deficits. Because here's what happens next. In our market for loanable funds, do you guys remember our market for loanable funds? Okay. So this right here is going to be the demand for loans, is going to be our supply of loanable funds. All right. Up here we have our interest rate. And down here we're going to have the quantity of loanable funds. So we have our supply, we have our demand, that's pretty easy. And we have our equilibrium interest rate and our quantity of loanable funds. Now the government steps in, and what would the government do to this equation, or this little model?
To the loanable funds or to?
To loanable funds.
What are you trying to do that? Oh, yeah.
The government's taking out a lot of loans, right?
Yeah.
They need to go into debt, so they need loans. So they sell a lot of bonds. So that means, what happens?
The quantity of loans decreases.
It would be decrease the interest rate.
Quantity of loans.
Loanable funds.
It would change the quantity of loanable funds. How? Who's now demanding more loans? The federal government, right? So you can say that the government is, whoa, I moved the whole thing. So here, let me go ahead and put that back. So the government steps in and says, hey, I need a lot of loans. So this is the demand for loans, and we'll call this demand for loans 1. What does that do?
It drives up the interest rate.
It's going to drive up the interest rate. Because now you could say, well, I could give my money to loan to this business, or I can give it to the government. So some will choose a business, but some will choose a government. Because there's an increase in demand for loans, causing a higher interest rate. So this higher interest rate does what to the amount of investment in the economy? It's going to move this line up, causing what to happen to our equilibrium quantity? There'd be less investment, and what does less investment do?
Decreases demand.
It would decrease demand, putting us right back to where we were. What is this effect called? It's not contractionary, it is fiscal policy, but this effect of when the government spends and deficit spends, all of a sudden, they go ahead and reduce investment spending because they increase interest rates down here. So that goes up here, reduces investment, and because they reduce investment, they took aggregate demand that increased from their spending and bring it right back down. That's called crowding out. That's called crowding out. That's when the government crowds out the market for loanable funds, making it harder for you to get a loan, harder for businesses to get loans, and therefore has what kind of effect on our aggregate supply and aggregate demand model?
Puts it back where it was.
Monetarists would say nothing. So crowding out's a real thing. A lot of people debate on how big the effect is. Keynesians would say the effect is very small. What would monetarists say? They'd say the crowding out effect would be very large. So they'd say, go back to that monetary policy. MV equals PQ. And that would solve your problems.
So that was the fiscal policy?
Oh, crowding out the,
Yeah.
The government buying more.
Fiscal is government, right? And monetary is like Fed.
And everyone knows the difference of nominal versus real, right?
nominal's not adjusted for inflation.
Right. Nominal is numeric. So if nominal GDP increases, how much did the economy grow?
However much it increased, or no, according to the price level.
It depends on the price level. Because if the price level increased 10% and real GDP increased 10%, if the price level increased 10% and nominal GDP increased 10%, how much did the economy actually grow? Zero. But if price level increases 10% and nominal GDP increases 20%, what did real GDP do?
Increased by 10%.
Increased by an extra 10%, which means, hey, now we all of a sudden understand that real GDP is what matters. But keep in mind, they're going to throw nominal and real at you. Nominal is numeric. Real has inflation adjusted. And that's going to help you for some of these monetarist questions. So the next thing I want to go over with you guys is we're going to go ahead and go over a little bit more fiscal policy. There's going to be a few fiscal policy questions. Some of the fiscal policy questions are going to deal with the multiplier. And you say, the multiplier, which multiplier does fiscal policy deal with? Not the money multiplier, but the...
I haven't heard it in so long.
Tax multiplier?
The tax multiplier as well as the
Government spending.
spending multiplier. Okay? To know those, we need to know our MPC and MPS. What is MPC?
Marginal propensity to consume.
Very good. And what's MPS?
Marginal propensity to save.
Very good. So consume means if I give you some disposable income, your marginal propensity to consume is how much you will spend, whereas your marginal propensity to save is how much of it you would save and put away. So let's go ahead and do a little practice problem for our marginal propensities to consume and save. All right, I'll shift you down here. All right, so if I go ahead and give you guys, let's say $5,000, all right? of disposable income. So disposable income is $5,000. Now, if that's the situation, let's say that you use $4,000 for consumption spending. Okay, I hope you guys see these equal signs for 4,000. And that means you're going, all right, now, I'm going to say that the marginal propensity to consume, I'm going to make this stated, not asking you to calculate it, but I'm going to go ahead and say that it's 0.8. Now, so here's my little level. I'm going to go ahead and add $200, I'll make that $1 there, of disposable income. I want you to tell me this. What happened to consumption spending and what happened to savings? What is the total amount of consumption? And what's my total savings? I'm going to give you guys a minute here to solve. All right, so if you were going to solve what total consumption spending, what should that be?
What the new consumption spending is?
The amount of consumption with this and this.
Oh gosh. Oh wait, no, is that the number? Yeah, 4160. Okay, I thought you wanted me to subtract it.
So there's going to be a total of $4,160. How much total savings will there be?
$840.
Okay, not good.
That's
Anyone figure out the total savings?
Oh no. Is it $1,040?
Very good.
Yeah.
One, these two need to equal what?
5,200.
Yeah, our initial 500 and our additional 200. So that's kind of your giveaway. If we have $5,000 and you spend 4,000 of it consuming things, what does that mean?
You have 1,000.
You have 1,000, not left over, but 1,000 put into.
So you save.
Yeah, remember, you only do two things with money. You
Save or spend.
you consume or you spend. So there is a little bit of savings over here that we should also know is already 1,000. Now, if this is 8, you would know that if I give you $1, you will do what with 80 cents? Spend it, and you'll do what with the other 20? So if I give you $200, how much of that will you spend? 160. So you put the 160 onto your 4,000 from here. And what do you do with the rest? The extra 40, you save it. So you take that 1,000 and you bring it right here with the extra 40. That's how you solve. Now, this is 0.8 and you go, oh, okay, cool. That's very nice. What if I made this 0.7? Can I do that first?
Yeah.
Yes, I can. Okay, you go, but that doesn't match here. Yes, I can. Does that change our answer?
Yeah.
To what?
No.
See, no, that's
Okay.
I'm gonna calculate it, but
All right. Now go ahead and solve.
7 times. Do you do it for you or just?
Wait, so this is not including the extra 200?
No, I'm adding the 200.
Oh, so it is.
What would this be right here, and what would this be right here? At 7. I also am adding 200, and we're starting with this, and we already have this.
4,140.
Very good. That's going to be 4,140. And you say, don't you have to adjust this number, this 4,000? The answer is no. I gave that to you. I already told you how much has been spent in consuming. Now I say, here's new money, which means new money applies to here, not up there. Okay, so not to this one. That should help you. And what would total savings be then?
1,060.
1,060. Very good. The money has to go somewhere. So that's a key problem. You should work out and figure out how we got those numbers, because that's going to be quite useful. Here, let's go ahead and try another question. All right. So let's go ahead and say that we have a government. And a government wants to increase spending. They have some projects that they want to increase. However, they don't want the price level to increase. How would they do this? Using only fiscal policy.
What do you want to do?
The government wants to increase spending. So we have our government, and they want to increase spending, but they want to keep the same price level. Now, they only use fiscal policy. You can't say, tell the Federal Reserve to sell bonds. No, no, no. Just fiscal policy.
Decrease taxes.
Okay, if they decrease taxes, that means people would have
More spending money.
more spending money. If people have more spending money, I'll shortcut this one. If they increase spending and they decrease taxes, what does decreasing taxes do? The tax multiplier means you have more money. If you have more money, you will do what? Demand more, causing more inflation. Okay, so is it going to be decreased taxes?
No.
No. So how are we going to solve this? So it's not decreasing taxes. That's the wrong answer. What's the right answer?
Increase interest rates.
No, you can't do that. Fed does that. Or the government can crowd out, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to assume no crowding out. Not increase borrowing, because that would cause more inflation. Okay, so we're not going to assume there's crowding out. Guys, if decreasing taxes cause demand to increase even more, what?
Raise taxes.
Right, if we raise taxes, that means that the government decides to start spending. That would shift aggregate demand up there. But if I raise taxes, it would move aggregate demand where?
Back to equilibrium.
Back to equilibrium. However, I'm not finished yet. I want to see if you guys really get it. If I increase spending by, let's say, a factor of 1, how much do I have to increase taxes?
2. Half.
2? Half? Which one?
1.
Does that have something to do with the tax multiplier?
It has everything to do with the tax multiplier. What's bigger, the spending multiplier or the tax multiplier? The spending's always bigger. So, if I want to go ahead and I want to keep price levels the same, that means I have to do what? I increase spending by a factor of 1. I need to increase taxes by a factor of more than 1. Okay? So remember, spending multiplier is your marginal propensity to consume. You take your marginal propensity to save and go, how many times does it go into 1? So if I give you marginal propensity to consume of 0.8, what's our spending multiplier?
What's the point?
No, it's going to be what's left over,
2.
2. How many times does 2 go into 1?
5.
5. So that would be our spending multiplier. But our tax multiplier is how many times does the marginal propensity to save go into the marginal propensity to consume? So it would be what? So we said if our equals 0.8. That means our multiplier, our spending multiplier, is what again?
Is 5.
5. What's our tax multiplier? So 0.8, that means our marginal propensity to save is what? If that's 0.8,
1 over.
it needs to be 0.2. So we said how many times does 2 go into 1? 5, and that's our spending multiplier. But our taxing multiplier is how many times does marginal propensity to save go into marginal propensity to consume, which means our multiplier would be 4. So you could actually then calculate how much exactly do you have to spend to equal that. And it would be
So the spending multiplier is like 1 over 1 minus MPS, right?
no, the spending multiplier is 1 over 1 minus MPC, which is
Okay. And
Your
then the tax
percent.
multiplier is MPC divided by MPS.
yes. So MPC over MPS. So that's one that if you know your formulas, you should have gotten this one much easier by going, it has to be more than 1, right? So that's your little savings there. Okay. Now we're going to move on into exchange and our exchange markets. So let's see if I have anything that can help us with that. Who knows? Oh, we do. Okay, so we have United States and China and everything there. It's good to write these problems out and knowing what each thing means, okay? You will not be given little lines like this, okay? But it's good to know which one equals which. So let's go ahead and try a practice problem, okay? Why don't we do it? Let's go ahead and say it's the EU, which means we're talking about euros, okay? What happens to exchange rates if the European Union demands more U.S. goods? What will happen if the European Union demands more U.S. goods? What's that?
Demand will increase.
Whose demand would increase?
US.
So that means
European supply would increase.
okay. So the demand for U.S. dollars would what?
Wait,
Would stay the same.
let's see the same,
Like,
right? 'Cause
demand for US dollars would increase.
Demand for U.S. dollars would increase. Okay? Why?
they're demanding more, right?
They want more of our goods, so they have to turn their euros into dollars.
Okay.
That means if it's an increase in demand, we must have an
Supply increase.
increase in supply. Meaning the dollar will appreciate while the euro will depreciate. Now, that's usually where it ends. Sometimes we'd say, but what would happen in the long run? If the American dollar has appreciated, that means American goods are now
More expensive.
more expensive. And European goods, in contrast, would appear to be,
Cheaper.
and what would eventually happen in the long run?
Demand more European.
We'd start, well, you can say demanding more European goods, which is kind of true. And by demanding more European goods, we'd have to supply more US dollars, bringing us back to where? That equilibrium. So, that's one. What about this? What if the EU starts buying a lot more US bonds?
They'll supply more dollars, and then the US would demand. There'd be more demand for US dollars.
Wait, what?
The EU would supply more euros, and there'd be demand for more US dollars. So what you say?
All right, so they want more US bonds.
Yeah, so
So
they
buy
demand more.
So they would what?
Demand more.
They demand more dollars, and therefore, what would happen over here? If demand shifts,
Supply will increase.
supply would have to increase. So remember, demand moves to the other supply in the same direction, causing the dollar to and the euro to depreciate. Okay? What about if Europe, well, that was already an increase in investment, but what if the European Union increases their interest rates? There's a few ways this one can go.
Demand would increase, or?
Whose demand? Don't say it.
The,
The demand for
Euros.
euros would
increase.
increase. Because what would you do with your money? You could put it in the US and get 5%, or you could turn it into euros and get 7%. What would you do with your dollar?
Turn it into euros.
It would go ahead and shift demand, and that would in turn, US would supply more dollars to Europe. Or it means that we could go ahead and say, well, maybe that's not how I want to see it. It could go a slightly different way. What would happen to the demand for US dollars?
Decrease.
Yeah, would Europeans invest in US dollars?
No.
No. And that means what would happen over here?
Supply would increase.
Right. They would supply less euros to the US, both of which have the same effect. They'll cause the euro to appreciate while the dollar would depreciate. And that means European goods would end up being more expensive and US goods would end up being cheaper. Yes?
So the left side's euro, the right side's US, right?
No. Remember, if we're ever going which one's which, the key is what's on the bottom. Oh, come on. So, since US is on the bottom, this is the market for dollars. Since the euro's on the bottom, this is the market for euros. Okay, so if you're ever looking at one of these and going, I don't know how to draw it, you always put the base currency at the base. So if it's on the bottom here, then it's this, and it's on the bottom here.
So how do you know if it depreciates or appreciates? Like,
Okay, so here, fair enough. Let's go ahead and go back a little bit. All right, we're at our equilibrium. So we said, what's going to happen in Europe if they have higher interest rates?
People want, or this demand for the euro will go up.
Sure, we can go one way, which is demand for Europe increases, causing the supply of dollars to Europe to increase. Now, here, let me just go back for a moment and I'll make this a little bit easier. Let's go ahead and say here is our base rate, where we're starting. So now I'm going to increase interest rates in Europe. We said demand would shift to here. And what would happen here?
Supply increase.
Now, remember, this line is basically the price of a euro, which means what did the price of a euro do? It increased. And it's the price of a euro in US dollars. What happened to US dollars here for the price of a dollar? It decreased. So that means it takes fewer euros to buy a dollar and more dollars to buy a euro. Fairly easy there. So make sure you understand these concepts well and some of their other effects. Now, we also need to cover this guy right here. Current accounts and financial accounts. Current accounts is the trade of what?
Like goods, services, and, oh man.
Transfers.
Goods, services, and transfer payments. Goods, services, and transfer payments, which means if we're going to go ahead and use the examples of the United States and China, it's pretty simple that we need to make sure we understand. With US and China, let's assume we're not at an equilibrium here. Do we export more or do we import more from China?
What were the conditions again?
Right now,
Import.
we know that, and usually they'll tell you which one or give you a reason why. So right now we import more, okay? And that means China must
This export more.
export more. The current account has to balance, right? So you'd say there's a trade deficit. And that's not necessarily good, but what is going to happen in our financial account, also called the capital account or our capital flow?
The inflows will exceed the outflows.
All right, remember, if we have this here, we know that down here it needs to be what? Can it be equal? It needs to be the opposite. So now that China, because they're exporting more, they get more US dollars. What are they going to do with those US dollars? They're not going to keep them. They're going to
Invest them,
buy American
bonds, or
assets,
Yeah.
including bonds. So that means China is going to have large outflows, whereas the U.S. then must have large inflows. All right, meaning that the financial account and the current account must be what?
Inverse.
Balanced. Okay, and inverse.
Yeah.
So if extra money goes here, extra money needs to come back in financial account. And we said if they don't equal each other, it's called a
Oh, man.
statistical discrepancy. It must balance, and if it doesn't balance, then someone did their math wrong.
Yeah.
And our net capital outflow needs to do what?
It's negative for the U.S.
Okay? So net capital outflow. What are outflows doing at the U.S.?
Negative. No, 'cause it's our-
What's bigger, outflows or inflows? If that's there. Inflows is bigger, therefore outflows must be negative. And China's outflows are bigger than its inflows, therefore the net capital outflows are positive. Okay? Easy stuff, but you definitely want to study and understand why these things happen. So, with that, you need to know your current financial accounts, and also keep in mind a few little ideas about trade. Do you guys understand this? Okay. For example, what are some of the benefits to trade?
Specialization.
Specialization, as in it allows America to allocate our resources what?
More efficiently.
More efficiently, as in America, we have more skilled people, high technology, so we produce things we're better at. As in, is America really good at producing cheap plastic goods or clothing? No. Who's better at that?
China.
Right, they have a what on us, on that good?
Higher
Salary. No.
Advantage. Okay.
A comparative advantage, where we have a comparative advantage in kind of finer, higher price goods and name brands. So trade allows us to do what we're best at and allowing China to do what? What they are best at. Other things it does is, what does it do to the price of clothes or cheap plastic goods in the U.S.? It makes it cheaper for you, therefore making you what?
More rich.
Wealthier. You can buy more things, have a better standard of living, and feel wealthier. And what does it do for China? What does it make our finer goods to them? Because we're really good at it. No. It makes it cheaper because if they tried to produce it themselves, it would be much more expensive for them. So who gets wealthier with trade? Both sides. Now sometimes one country can benefit more and we can get into a lot of debates there. But that's it. And the thing is, does everyone win with trade? What about the American clothing company or the American factory who is making those cheap goods? Do they win? No, they'll go out of business. But that's because they're what?
In the wrong country.
Okay, not so much in the wrong country. They're in the right country, but
They don't have the advantage.
they don't have the advantage and they're not as efficient as the other ones. So some people can lose jobs and that's bad. However, who's going to benefit? The United States, China, other industries that are more efficient, that trade and that those tech goods, which means the long run benefits compared to the short run downfalls are what?
Greater.
They're much greater. Long run benefits are much, much greater. But if we add tariffs, that means what will happen to trade?
Make it more difficult.
It would make it more difficult. Therefore, it would decrease. And if it decreases, are you going to get necessarily the cheaper goods from China? No, you won't. You'll have to spend more money. That makes you what? Poor, less wealthy. And therefore, resources won't be allocated quite as well. And therefore, tariffs reduce trade, but we like to think in economics, trade is good. All right. But here, let me give you guys a little bit of a tough one here. Okay? So I'm going to go back and erase tons of stuff. But we're going to go back to our initial graphs up here, put them back at equilibrium. And now, what I want to do is this. The Federal Reserve buys bonds. The Federal Reserve buys bonds.
Is it the top chart?
To the top chart here, what happens to the US dollar and what happens to the euro? Take a minute right now and try to think.
Federal Reserve buys bonds?
What'd you say?
The Federal Reserve buys bonds. So here,
Buys European bonds or?
no.
So it depreciates.
The Fed buys, I'll put a little plural there, U.S. bonds.
Money supply increases.
Okay, so we're going to break it down step by step. The money supply increases. And if the money supply increases, that'll do what to interest rates?
Decrease the interest rates.
It would decrease interest rates. That means U.S. interest rates are now lower. Let's assume Europe's done nothing. So lower interest rates, we know, will have what effect on these graphs here?
They would demand less.
Who's they?
European Union.
European would demand
Less.
less.
US dollars.
Okay, European Union would demand less U.S. dollars, and that means that
Those apply.
Increase the supply of euros.
it would decrease the supply of euros. You could also say in the same breath that it could make European interest rates appear to be higher, and therefore we would demand rates and supply them with more dollars. Both have what?
Same effect.
What is that effect?
Appreciate.
Well, which one's which? The US dollar will
Depreciate.
depreciate while the euro will appreciate. And if you understand that, you should have a lot of things. And that will cause what to happen to US exports?
Decrease.
Okay? It'll cause US exports to
Increase, wouldn't it?
increase because the dollar is now cheaper. Okay? Therefore, exports would increase and imports from Europe would decrease. And you also need to know what would happen if that's the case, if we go ahead and say, all right, let's not say this is China, let's say this is the EU in this example. That means US exports would be bigger. That means European imports would be less. What would that do to capital outflows or financial flows?
Well, we have more money, so we would have to offload more.
So we would have to outflow more into Europe, and they
Then we get more inflow because we get more money from exports, meaning like.
What are you talking about? It's goods, right?
okay? Yeah.
No, because we get more money from exports, meaning we will.
So we're going to flow our dollars into Europe now because we have all these euros. What are we going to do with them? Because what we have been doing is getting the money from the European Union in trade by having excess trade. So I hope you guys understand that concept. That's pretty easy. A few other things to keep in mind. I'll go really quick. Our M1 and M2. Everyone knows M1 is what things?
Liquid.
Liquid assets. What are the three things?
Check
Cash.
deposits.
Checkable deposits. What's the other thing? Cash. And the last part is
Traveler check.
traveler's checks. Put them in order from the largest amount to the smallest amount.
Cash, checkable deposits, traveler's checks.
False.
Check deposits. Cash. Traveler check.
That's right. It was the original order you gave. Checkable deposits is the largest. Most people have most of their money in their checking account. They keep some in cash, and traveler's checks just aren't very important, so you don't see a lot of them. They're a small fraction. Overall, yeah. There's more money in checking accounts. Do you have a checking account?
Yeah. I never have any.
Do you have more money in cash on you or more money in that checking account?
Checking account.
So it shouldn't be surprising, should it? Okay, and what do you think about me? Do I have more money in my checking account or in my pocket right now?
You carry all your
Yeah, you got stacked.
Yeah, no, I do not have stacks nor wads. Okay, I have a few dollars and I have plastic cards that I use to buy things. Okay. The other thing there is M2. What is M2?
Non-liquid.
Less liquid assets.
Including M1.
It's all of M1, very good, and time deposits. So like savings accounts, CDs, money market accounts there. Also, keep in mind when we talk about our circular flow, I hope you guys kind of remember our circular flow that I know I have it here somewhere. Man, so many different charts. We said there's some problem with as the money and goods and services flow in this program. Whoop, that is not what I want to do at all. We know that there's leakage, and leakage comes from people doing what with their money? Households or firms doing what?
Holding on to it.
But not holding it, they...
Just like not investing.
Remember, you only do two things with your money.
Save or spend.
So if you're not spending it, you are
saving it.
saving it. So saving is called leakage in that circular flow. And keep in mind, there are going to be questions about comparative and absolute advantage. So make sure you're kind of fresh on that. And you go, oh, I don't want to study that. Except, will you see that on your macro test?
No.
Yes. Will you see it on your micro test?
Yes.
Yes. So is it a good thing to study? Yes.
That's easy one.
Hopefully you find it very easy. And it should be, but review it so you understand. It should, you understood it at one point and you should get it. Also keep in mind problems with stagflation. Everyone knows stagflation when we talk about in economics. We don't call it stagflation. We call it what in this class?
Disinflation.
It's not disinflation. It's definitely not that thing.
Inflation.
Stagflation. What is stagflation? Happened in the 70s. Why did that happen in the 70s?
Inflation. Oh, because of oil.
Because the oil price, OPEC had the embargo, gas prices went up. Oil is a huge, huge input in almost everything we make. So if input prices go up, what happens to our big model here?
So demand would increase.
Wrong.
Okay, demand would increase.
Supply would. Right, it's more expensive to make everything. That means the price level here wouldn't hold. You wouldn't produce as much at the same price. You would have to charge more. And if you guys are paying more, you demand more wages. So it's a phenomenon where you get higher prices, but you also get, so here's our new price level, but you're going to get high unemployment and actually less, what?
Output.
Less output. So that's why stagflation's that weird one. What do we call this?
Oh, man, I'm looking for it.
A type of inflation.
Cost push?
Cost push inflation. The cost of gas causes inflation. So it's one of those weird phenomena. In monetary policy, how do you fix this?
Oh man.
You would what was it? The reserve. You would
All right, this is a tough one.
decrease it.
Decrease it
Well,
is a terrible answer.
really? Like oh no, you would increase it.
What's it?
The reserve.
All right, here's the problem.
ratio.
With money supply, you can only move demand. So you can try to get out of the recession down here by increasing demand, increasing the money supply, causing what?
Higher inflation.
More inflation. So that's bad, because now all of a sudden people might expect that, and they're going to demand more wages, and you just get even higher inflation. Or you can get rid of inflation by doing what?
By bringing back the supply.
You start raising interest rates, and if you raise interest rates, you move demand
To the left.
to the left, and you get rid of inflation, but now what has happened to,
You get a recession.
you get a bigger recession, higher unemployment. So cost push inflation is bad, and you typically don't like it, and typically the economy would sort it out as they go, I'm not going to use oil, I'll use other things and stuff like that. But it's a problem and a blight, and not many policies are very good at fixing it. So I hope you guys study these. I hope you work through the problems and understand what we're doing. And I think you guys are going to do pretty well on this quiz. So let me go ahead and... Oop, nope, that's not it. Ooh. Okay, ignore that, everyone, and good luck on your exam.